Compare that to the rest of the market, small molecules at around 4%. So biologics really are growing about 3% year on year. And we don't see that slowing down. The biologics that are the newest and next generation biologics are more complex, newer technologies, cell and gene therapies all sit on there and, of course, are more expensive. Now, that means that we have a market size of about $350 billion as of, this was Q2 2019. So if we take a look at the top 10 biologics, however, this picture is very interesting to me because it's changed wildly over the last couple of years or so. Keytruda didn't used to be up there. Keytruda used to be number 12 about a year ago, and now suddenly it's at the second largest biologic. And that's going to continue climbing, especially as Humira starts feeling some of the impact of biosimilars. That's when we start getting the switch over the next few years or so, where Keytruda is going to be the number one biologic. But strong risers as well, Stelara, Opdivo, are starting to come through, Trulicity as well, possibly the newest anti-diabetic biologic there that's actually starting to come up into the top 10. The ones that we've seen drop, Herceptin has dropped from there over the last sort of 6 months or so. That used to be in the top 10, and that's been one of the largest ones that has fallen. The ones that I've colored in yellow, however, those are the ones that are threatened by LOE, either by having a biosimilar in market now or one that's in development currently. So we can see that we're heading towards quite a strong shake-up if biosimilars indeed turn out to be as market disruptive as some of us think that they might. So this is current biosimilars market. So the way we track it is looking at biosimilars that go through an approved biosimilar pathway. So those that go through a generics pathway or through the innovative pathway, those are excluded from this. However, when we do add up that, you can expect to add another billion or so through the non-sort of biosimilar pathways. But quite clearly, the largest contributor to biosimilar sales currently is Europe, that dark blue bars, and increasingly so the US in the light blue. The US has a problem with actually getting biosimilars launched. So it's fine approving biosimilars out there. It's approved biosimilars before Europe has. Launch has a few stumbling blocks, predominantly on the strength of its the patent laws out in the US and some of the prescriber incentives. But uptake seems to not be too bad either. So when we take a look at the latest figures on some of the oncology drugs, that is Herceptin biosimilars and MabThera or Rituxan biosimilars in the US, those are actually tracking at about the same rate that Europeans saw biosimilar uptake for those oncology drugs here in Europe. So the latest biosimilar news from the US seems to be like actually they uptake isn't too bad, specifically for some of them. This is June. Actually, this is September, so that's a typo that's my mistake. We updated this recently. But this is what we have from a biosimilars perspective that have been approved all the way from a decade and a bit ago. So you can see that it's quite a busy market. So this is just approvals as well. We have some withdrawals in there. Some companies have decided not to launch in European markets, Pfizer being the latest, saying that they're not going to launch their adalimumab candidate here. But the US is starting to play catch-up with Europe in terms of approvals, so it's starting to bring as many approvals as it can onto the market. But the two clear trends here. One is that we've got quite a lot of autoimmune and oncology indications up there, and we see that going forwards, that as companies get more and more interested in the oncology space, that's going to become the predominant biosimilar competitive sort of environment of the future. This is the current situation. So this is a heat map. Across the top, we have all the molecules of interest, so the latest biosimilars, essentially, and some select countries here. But what we see is that there's a few key trends. One, that it's very market dependent. Two, that some molecules do really quite well in certain markets. So anything to do with hospital at the very top, as you can see, anything sort of hospital administered in EU5 countries tends to do quite well. There are some outliers there. The Nordics are usually quite strong, and that's due to their tender markets. We've seen that before. But countries like Finland have started to see maybe a slight drop in the biosimilar uptake. And that's because companies are fighting back on price, and we're really starting to see that, and especially in the markets, where we're starting to see a switch back from the biosimilar market back to the originator. And biosimilar companies aren't necessarily too happy with this situation, but as a patient or as a payer, you can see that this is how a healthy market operates, is that we are going to take whatever's the best value out there for us. So US catching up, pegfilgrastims at 25% there alongside this insulin. So pegfilgrastim is doing quite well. And bevacizumab, which is the latest data that we have, is now at 10% in the US. And this is October data, so I think that's about 3 months post-launch, 2 or 3 months post-launch, already at 10%. So actually not too bad when you take all things into account. The next thing I want to point out is that as biosimilars are launched in Europe, they are becoming increasingly faster. The uptake is becoming increasingly faster. That's because physicians and payers are getting used to them. Hospitals are preparing well in advance. Frameworks are being generated. So the good news is that uptake is increasing. However, we're starting to see now with the latest ones that actually we might be saturating at about a natural uptake rate. This is up to about month 12, so in the first year, we are now starting to see that we see uptake rates of about 40%. So 40% after 1 year seems to be the current gold standard. We're next going to mark the 2-year mark. Is rituximab is the only one that we've tracked so far that has 2 years worth of sales on there, and that's about 60%. So it's about 40% in the first year, 60% by the second year. If we can beat that, then we're on a good track. And like I said, bevacizumab and so the Avastin biosimilar and trastuzumab, the Herceptin biosimilar in the US, is starting to track along this curve quite nicely as well. So those are 2 oncology ones there. If we do a little deep dive in adalimumab, this is the sort of picture that we see. So it's obviously very nuanced there, with some uptakes being very fast. A lot of you have already seen this a few times. There's not much that's changing on the leading end, other than the UK is sort of the uptake of the UK has increased and surpassed Germany recently, and France is we're expecting France to actually potentially have a little bit of an uptick soon, but the picture is very nuanced. So when we talk to companies, it's not so much now about just having a national policy. They really need to start looking at some national policies. When you break down a country individually by where the hospitals of major use are, or different regions, where the sick funds are, for example, in Germany, there is wide and quite huge variation depending on the biosimilar and how it's administered. So really it's about just trying to understand where to target within the nation itself. So in the last few minutes, I just want to focus on what we see in the future. So this is a study where we raked as much as we could from public sources, clinicaltrials.gov, sort of the European Commission websites, anything to do with company-reported pipeline information, and just try to understand out there in the competitive space what biosimilars are out there in the pipeline. Next, we use one of our forecasting tools and match that up against the patent information and the sales information that we had. So what we have here is at the time of LOE, what are the biggest biologics, and then I'll show you next where we have the most competition. But we see that the next sort of opportunities are potentially Humira in the US. Fine, that's well covered, and actually we see a lot of adalimumab candidates there operating against that. But further on, there's not much out there. Maybe some, one last haul from the anti-diabetics. We've got some NOACs in there as well. Keytruda, no, not necessarily NOACs because they're not biologics, so not the NOACs, but some oncologies, some ranibizumab is in there as well. I think potentially hidden within this Humira line there, and Keytruda and Opdivo further on towards 2030. So when companies take a look at this picture, there's a little bit of a mix. So these are the over $1 billion opportunities, the Keytrudas and the Humiras and so on, and everyone seems to be targeting this space. So when we take a look at a company by company sort of breakdown, we see that I'd say about 80 to 85% of companies have candidates and are trialing the opportunities up here, whether they're adalimumab, Eylea, ranibizumab, the Lucentis candidate, and so on. Now, what we've seen is that a large amount of competition is going to lead to a large price erosion. The latest discounting that we have is, that biosimilars are increasingly reaching sort of 70 to 80% discount as soon as you get 3 players or more onto the market. So depending on what your company's strategy is, if you're going to go for that one, you better hope that you're going to be first to market, that you're going to be launching on day one, that you're going to have a price that's going to be competitive in the environment, and that you're going to have an upfront good enough sort of marketing function already and sales specialist to actually get these biosimilars getting the uptake to the level that you want it. Because what we've seen is if you're sort of 4th, 5th to the market, it's very difficult to differentiate yourself unless you have something interesting, like potentially something that's actually shown value, so maybe by a better type innovation, or the only tool you have really is price if you're 4th, 5th to market. And then you just have to keep pricing down. So some companies that have come late have already started to see, actually, I don't know if biosimilars is for me. Companies that seem to come early say, great, biosimilars is a thriving market. So we have this a bit of an imbalance in views out there as to whether this the biosimilar strategy is going to work long term. Some of the advice that we're starting to give now is if you're not entirely sure that you're going to be capable of bringing a biosimilar first to market and compete with the big players out there, and now I rank companies like Samsung and Celltrion as some of the big players alongside Sandoz and Mylan and so on, is can you start taking a look at this range of maybe smaller opportunity biosimilars? Those are between $100 million and $1 billion, because those are right now we see that they're less competitive. There are not many candidates in the pipeline for that, meaning that price erosion is going to be much lower, potentially making sure that you have this strategy where you fit in quite nicely at a higher price for a longer time, albeit the overall opportunity is lower. Anything under 100 million, we don't really see much in there at all. That's we're talking about orphan biosimilars here. We're running studies now to see whether orphan biosimilars are even going to be a viable prospect. But really, until we see trial costs and regulation costs come down, anything under 100 million is not very likely in Europe and the US, at least, maybe in some Asian markets. So that's my time gone. Thank you very much, everyone, for that brief overview. I think the slides will be circulated later. Questions?
Yeah.
Do we have any questions?
Thank you very much for having these nice presentations.
Okay.
Some questions?
Oh, I think we have a question here at the front with you.
So it was very interesting. Thank you very much for all those numbers. So how do you see counterfeiting? Do you have any thoughts on how counterfeiting plays into that? Biosimilars and numbers, and if it's like more serious than with generics, or in which field it goes, or which ones are more prone to that, or any thoughts on that topic?
So I think counterfeiting isn't really a worry right now in Europe or the US. The market is too nascent, the players are too well known, and to be able to create a biologic that you're trying to sell off as something else as well, there's a lot of upfront investment that you could use in different areas, definitely. Like we see that the Asian markets are growing, so China's becoming a big area in biosimilars. But from what I know at the moment is that there is a bit of a two-tiered market. So the some Chinese operators are deciding not to enter the European or US markets purely because, to run trials and to get it approved in the US, it's going to be an extra $150 to $200 million, which they're not willing to spend at the moment. These guys have strategies that are regional currently, and they're looking in places like Latin America as their next entry points. They're not looking into Europe and the US. Market size is very small for those, and I don't think there's any counterfeiting or any problems as of yet within those players, because these are actually, they're trying to be as legitimate as possible for themselves and in their home country as well. They're having to jump through loads of hoops to be able to sell these biologics. Yeah. I think what's interesting is, will we see a similar sort of generic system where in China or India you have local biologics that maybe don't have the same sort of quality standards or the same sort of endpoints that the sort of Western biosimilars would have to go through. So you'd have sort of like an international market of biosimilars that are maybe priced slightly higher than a lower priced national market. Because speaking to some physicians in China, they're picking through the data, the clinical data, and they're saying, some of this data is not necessarily the strongest I've seen to get this biosimilar approved, right? So if China doesn't become stronger and making sure that the data standards are as stringent as the West, you might see a split in the market as well. Thank you.
Is there any additional questions for Aurelio? Then I have a short question to you here, because you said that that biosimilar environment will need an open US market in the future. Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, what does it mean in a practical way? What is really an open market for biosimilars?
Yeah, so an open market in the sense that I had put on the slide there is the US needs to open up and adopt biosimilars in a way that's is harmonious with the international view on biosimilars. So let it be harmonious with Europe. It really needs to, and I think certain areas of the US, the FDA is trying to push biosimilar uptake. I think the system is very difficult to change out there. But for a truly international biosimilars market to thrive, we really need the US. Companies can't make enough profit from Europe alone, especially when prices are already going down very low. The US needs to open up. We need to make sure that companies are confident that when they bring a biosimilar to market, they will get the price that they need, they will get the profit they need, and that might be from the US and it might be from Europe as well. Currently, companies that were creating adalimumab biosimilars, Humira biosimilars, 8-10 years ago when the programs began, they were running on numbers, they were banking on numbers that they're not getting right now. So, they never thought that they were banking on, well, maybe we'll get 25% discount, 30 at the most. So when they came to market and they have an 80% discount plus in some markets, they're having to reanalyze all their numbers and say, actually, we're not going to break even in 3 years. We're not going to break even in maybe 6 years, if we're lucky. So this is what I mean by the US opening up. We really need a huge market to open up to make sure that your break-even point remains within the 3-year point from launch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your talk. Okay.